Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's Kwentuhan with Cameo and Co, all about identity, a conversation on Indigenous identity, Filipino heritage, and how fashion can bring them together. And tonight, our guest joining us is Victor Baguilat Jr., who is an Ifugao fashion designer and founder of Kandama Collective. So we're super excited to have you all joining us here today to speak about such an important topic. For those of you who might not be familiar yet with Cambio & Co., so we are your hosts for today, and Cambio & Co. is an ethical fashion company that works with artisans in the Philippines to celebrate Filipino craftsmanship, culture, and heritage. So our main mission is really to create sustainable livelihood for Filipino artisans while also empowering Filipinos in the diaspora, such as myself, such as many of you here, to also celebrate our heritage and the people and places that we come from. Our rallying cry is really wear your heritage, which is one of our core advocacies, because we believe there is so much power that comes in wearing pieces that are not only designed and handcrafted in the Philippines, but that wear pieces that really truly share our stories and dive into our rich heritage as Filipinos in the diaspora and Filipinos in the Philippines as well. So I would love to invite you all to tag us on our Instagram, Cambio_Co, and at our hashtag Wear Heritage. If there's things that come up for you this evening that are really, that are insights for you, or that you're really excited to, to share that insight with other people, please do tag us, because we would love to reshare you on our channels and to just spread some of the learnings from today. So just a little bit as well about our team. So who we are, Cambio, we are a pretty small team. There's just really 3 of us. I am your host for today, which my name is Gelaine Santiago, and I am the co-founder of Cambio & Co. My fellow team members here are Jerome, who is my fellow co-founder, as well as my life partner. And then we have Nikki, who is Cambio's community storyteller based in Manila. So my fellow team members are not hosting this evening, or not on screen necessarily, but they are behind the scenes. They are managing the chat. So if you have any questions or any issues that come up, then message in the chat, or you can email us or message us on any of our socials, and one of our team members, Jerome or Nikki, will be helping to respond to you. So they'll just be kind of behind the scenes helping out. And so for me, I'm really honored to be hosting this conversation. I am, our team is based in Tikaranto, which is colonially known as Toronto. And this is a topic that is really, relevant to me on a personal level. I was born in Bulacan, and we immigrated here with my family when I was very young, and it really has been a long journey. I wasn't really connected for a long time with my Filipino heritage. And so it's really only been over the last few years that I've had the privilege to really explore and unpack that part of my identity and myself. And so fashion has actually been a really core medium to allow me to reconnect with my roots. And, the more that I learn about what it is to be Filipino, the more I realize just how diverse it is, and how there is so much to learn and to unpack, and that being Filipino is not, one thing. And there's so much in our history and our cultures, including the indigenous cultures that make up the Philippines, that a lot of us don't necessarily know about. So this is something that's definitely an interest and really relevant to me personally. And so I'm honored to be here with all of you today. Before we dive into our topic, of course, today we're talking about Indigenous cultures and Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, but of course we can't speak of Indigenous cultures in the Philippines without also acknowledging the Indigenous peoples and the lands that we reside in. And so today we'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're gathering on today. As guests is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat peoples, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We acknowledge that long before European settlers arrived and stole this land, which is known colonially as Toronto, this territory was the subject of the One Dish, One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations. And today this land continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, what is colonially known as North America. So we recognize that we are settlers on this land and that we have a responsibility to unlearn our roles and to work towards dismantling white supremacy and colonialist forces which continue to oppress and brutalize Indigenous peoples to this very day. This land acknowledgement is really just a small but a first step towards reconciliation and honoring the Indigenous communities whose land we reside on as settlers. So we would also like to take a moment as well to state our solidarity for Black lives and that we join the fight for Black liberation. We also stand alongside our friends, our family, our kababayan, and our fellow Filipinos, particularly those in the LGBTQ+ community, as they continue to fight against oppression in the Philippines this very day and at this very moment. So thank you all for being here and joining us for Kwentuhan with Cambio and Co. Kwentuhan is a Tagalog word meaning to tell stories and to have a conversation. And it's a word that we've used to guide us not only for this event series, but for our long-term direction as a company with Cambio and Co. Because there is so much power in having this back and forth and having this flow and having an open dialogue. And I think when it comes to really unpacking our histories and our identities and who we are, a lot of that begins with a conversation. And so that's really, what our guiding word is for Cambio is this idea of Kwentuhan and using storytelling as a way to foster community and conversations that really need to happen. So that is our Kwentuhan, and there are other topics in our series. This session is actually our third one. A few of you have joined us for our multiple Kwentuhan sessions, so thank you all for being here and for coming back. We have had other topics, so the next one, which is actually our final Kwentuhan session, is happening next week, featuring Jovi of Pinay Collection / Pina Letters, happening next week on Reconnection. And we also had previous topics about artistry, featuring Christine of Amami and Ariane Salazar of Pretty Positive, talking about self-love. So the recordings for those are actually available already online, and Nikki has added them to the chat for you to peruse after today's session. And so of course, we'd also like to thank our partner in our Kwentuhan series, who is Kape, Philippine Coffee. Some of you may have already heard them, but Kape is a Canadian social enterprise promoting direct-to-farmer coffee from Philippine Indigenous women growers and roasted in small batches. So Kwentuhan is actually perfect, enjoyed over drinks with friends. And so hopefully you all have a drink with you. I've got some tea. Victor, I think, has a big cup of coffee. Our team, I think Jerome has some mate. So hopefully you have your preferred beverage of choice. Yeah, whatever floats your boat. And if you stick around later in this evening, we do have a nice little surprise courtesy of our friends at Kape. So please do stick around. All right, and then finally, to just dive in to talk about the topic at hand, which is Kwentuhan, we can be all about identity. So, today we will be talking about what it means to be Filipino, talking about identity through the lens of fashion. Like, how do we honor Indigenous communities without appropriating them? And when the Philippines itself is made up of thousands of different islands, languages, multitudes of Indigenous cultures and pre-colonial history, what does it truly mean to be Filipino? What does Filipino fashion or Filipino heritage really look like? So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And also exploring what role does fashion have in bringing all of these forms of our identities together. And so to talk about today, we've got our friends at Kandama Collective, who is a couture fashion brand and social enterprise that celebrates Indigenous heritage in the Philippines while creating livelihood for Ifugao women weavers. So they have beautiful products using innovative product design, and they create artisanal products that express timeless elegance of Indigenous art in a modern day setting. And to date, Kandama has trained 29 rice and vegetable farmers in the traditional art of handloom weaving. We are very honored to have Victor Baguilat Jr., who is the founder and designer of Kandama, to join us here tonight. So Victor himself is a very impressive person. And so I actually haven't had the privilege yet to actually meet Victor in person, but Jerome, who is my partner, met him while he was in Philippines last year. And I think they attended, I think it was Artefino, like one of the really big artisan fairs together. And so I just remember Jerome, FaceTiming with him that evening while he was still in Manila, and him telling me how he met this like amazing designer who's doing these really innovative, like beautiful designs, and who's also like really committed to sharing his heritage, his Ifugao heritage with the Philippines and globally. And so since then, like we've just been keeping an eye on Kandama and what they've been doing. And it's actually, they met at Manila Fame, not Artefino. I shouldn't mix those up. But yeah, so, Victor himself is an Indigenous fashion designer whose works have been featured in Paris Fashion Week, Melbourne Fashion Week, and Virgin Australia Melbourne Fashion Festival, and more. And he's also a finalist of the Young Social Entrepreneurs Program, and has been recognized by the Development Bank of Singapore and the National University of Singapore as one of the 100 social enterprises in Asia to watch in 2018. So we're very honored to have Victor here to join us, and he will be doing a brief presentation to just share a bit more about his story and Kandama's work before we head into the Kwentuhan portion. So I'd like to invite Victor to take the floor, and yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So let me just go on to the presentation. So this is going to be about identity, and for the most part, identity has something to do with search for joy and happiness and who you are, like what you're here for, like, on this planet. Gelaine, sorry, do you have the presentation up? Is it there already?
Yes. So you need
okay. Okay, perfect. Let me just. Okay, maybe you can just toggle it through.
You got it.
Okay, perfect.
You got it. There.
Okay, so if you can see on the screen, it's I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Ikigai. The concept largely is that it's at the intersection of the things that you love, what the world needs, what you're being paid for, and what your profession is. So it's really looking for the overlap of all of these things. And I guess my why then has something to do with that, like finding joy. And joy is something that's internal. It's not something that's external. So it's something from within you. And this search for joy became, I guess, like a more intense when I was in law school. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with how sensationalized law school is in the Philippines. Like a lot of our senators are actually lawyers. Majority of our presidents were actually lawyers. So it's a very romanticized profession, and it just happens that my dad is also a lawyer, and my brother's a lawyer. So there's an expectation for me to become a lawyer, and I was also a competitive debater back in college. So the expectation is there that just because you can argue, automatically you should be a lawyer. So yeah, so I was in law school for 4 years, and then I was very unhappy. There were times that I was just like cry before my classes because I don't want to read and memorize like provisions of the law, of family code, etc. It just wasn't something that I'm very happy with up until my fourth year, actually, when I dropped out of law school. There was this one time that I saw this video on YouTube wherein there was this guy who was doing all the lovely things in his life. Like he was skydiving, scuba diving, like meeting up with friends, like meeting up with celebrities and stuff. And I told myself, I want to do that. I just want to have fun, you know? And I realized at the end of the video that the reason why he was doing that was because he only had 2 years to live. So he had terminal illness. And at that point, I told myself, I wish I also had cancer so that I can justify to my parents leaving law school. And when you say something like that to yourself, you know that you're not in a good space. So I know that, I'm spiraling downhill. So I have to do something about it. And without telling my parents, I went out of law school. I told myself, if there's nothing out there, then I'm going to go back to law school. But if there's something, that yay, it's great. So meaning I'm going to live the kind of life that I want to live for myself, not necessarily something which my parents wanted from me or what I feel like society wanted me to do. So that's generally like the story. So yeah, like despite the fact that I was winning like some competitions in law school, it just wasn't something that I'm happy with. So in 2015, I decided to quit law school. 2016, I joined the Young Social Enterprise competition, entrepreneurs competition, just like a lot of millennials who would go out there and just Google, for example, what is the meaning of life? So I just started Googling that, and it led me to social entrepreneurship. And then that Google search led me to the website of the Singapore Foundation. There was an open application for a social enterprise. So even if you don't have any idea yet, you will find you can participate and join and submit the idea. So it happens that they liked the idea, and then so eventually we got some technical support from McKinsey for the establishment of the social enterprise. And then in 2017, I officially launched the Kandama here in the Philippines. So there was, we wrote to the press, we invited them, we wrote to different ambassadors to come over and some celebrities to actually witness the official launch. This happened in, just like 3 years ago. I didn't have any background at all when it comes to fashion designing. I feel like I'm more of a systems designer. I love building organizations. So Kandama actually is my second corporation. So the first one was a digital media company. This one is a social enterprise. So I love like building structures and systems and what have you. The concept initially that I wanted was to link different fashion designers with the communities. And then when it became very difficult to do that, and I have to applaud, like Gelaine and the rest of the Cambio team for being able to put together different brands and different designers on a platform, because it's very difficult. But when I had a difficulty doing that, I just decided, okay, I want to be a product designer. So I'm going to do like fashion designing, especially because there was an invitation from Melbourne Fashion Festival from the Global Indigenous Network for me to showcase some of the items that we were making. So I was thinking, okay, let me do that myself. So in 2018, that's the time that we showcased our first international show. And yeah, like Jelaine mentioned about the NUSDBN Social Venture Challenge. So that all happened in 2018. 2019, that's when we started to, I guess like I got more confidence to do like bigger shows like New York Fashion Week and Paris Fashion Week. It's because of the kind of traction that it got from in 2018 that other show organizers were interested in, in showcasing or featuring our stuff. And then 2020, there's a lot of open possibilities that they have right now. Like one of it is actually collaborating with Miss Universe Philippines. In 2019, I also made some dresses for Miss Universe Philippines, Gazini Ganados for the competition. So why did I choose Ifugao weaves? Well, if you're gonna go back to the Ikigai part of that is something to do with my identity. It's something that I love. For the most part, I did not really grow up in Ifugao. So my dad is Ifugao, so there's this always part of me which asks, what does it really mean to be Ifugao? What does it really mean to be Indigenous, especially given the fact that I am working with a lot of Indigenous designers and celebrities on the global scene, and there's always that kind of conversation about like being Indigenous. But the reason why I chose like Ifugao is because, well, that's where my dad is, and I guess I wanted to reconnect with that part of me as well. So I guess being Ifugao also has something to do with what you identify with, like whether or not you identify being such, more than anything else. So I guess like you define what that identity is. So that's the reason why I chose Ifugao. And for the most part, there's a lot of accusations with respect to cultural appropriation. So I don't want that, you know, like that issue somewhere near my name. So at least if I'm gonna work with like Ifugao Weaves, that, you know, which is the community that I belong to, it's much easier for me to explain that, you know, like it's really for the community, and it's largely because I know how what are the sacred textiles that shouldn't be used and what have you, and I can explain the culture as well and connect the weavers from the with the global marketplace. So this was a time that I was also starting to look for, you know, well, I've gained a lot of weight actually. Yeah, this is a time that I've started to look for what I really wanted to do, to look for my ikigai. And it's true what Steve Jobs said, that you only connect the dots when you look backwards, because my thesis back in college was something to do with women empowerment. So when I was thinking of like a social enterprise or an idea for a social enterprise, I had to think of the things that make me happy. So you got fashion over there, that there's culture, tradition, like my indigenous heritage and my identity is part of them. But one of the things that is in the mix was my thesis in college, which is about women empowerment. So I had to look for something wherein women are actually empowered, largely because the conclusion of my thesis is that they're key agents for community development. And there's actually the highest return of investment if you invest in women, especially in their education. So yeah, so the mix of all of this is actually the social enterprise that I have right now. So this is the traditional wear of the Ifugaos. Unfortunately, like they don't wear this on a regular basis. They only wear it during special occasions. So it really is a dying tradition, and it's something that we want to keep. And given that the Ifugaos only wear these things during special occasions, means that there's not enough demand. So it's not a livelihood that can, you know, like take care of an entire family. So we need to find ways to expand the market so that the weavers will continue weaving, and the younger generation would also like pick up the tradition and continue it for survival purposes. So this is the photo shoot that we had in New York. So the model there is also Filipino American, and on the right is a photo of one of our weavers who had actually a medical problem. So the thing is that like she became a weaver because she cannot do farming tasks because of her medical condition. So it's a good alternative for her. And for a lot of other farmers, when, you know, like subsistence farming, for example, in the Philippines is not enough. So you need another livelihood to complement that kind of livelihood. And weaving is something that they can do in between farming. It's also sometimes that they can do at home if they have the loom with them. So we also donated to the looms. So we are largely about sustainable fashion because it takes forever to make the weave. It's, you know, it's as opposed to like fast fashion. The carbon footprint is definitely less than company like manufacturers actually do. Or produce, and we're also in line with, you know, Cambio. We are about ethical luxury. The luxury part comes in the fact that the fabrics are just more expensive than the ones that you would get from countries like China, for example, that are manufactured and scaled on a massive level. So you wouldn't see a lot of these like fabrics. Sometimes like once the weaver is done with it, like it's very difficult for the weaver to make something exactly the same as the one that they actually made. So it's one of a kind, which also, I guess like it's a bit problematic in terms of the economic performance of it, right? Because it's difficult to scale it. So the way that we go about it is to really market it, and in order to increase the value of the fabrics, and we tell the story of the weavers so that people can really understand the real cost of these and the real value of these fabrics. It's a heritage piece. So this is from the weaving center to you know, like the model actually wearing it. So this means, this is a shield actually. So it carries symbols, different like material culture in of Ifugao. So the crisscrossing symbol here is actually a symbol of plants. And this one, this is shield for in Ifugao, but in other Cordillera regions, it symbolizes something else. It symbolizes a shield. Oh, sorry, a flower. So there you go. Okay, so when I started doing shows overseas, it's when I guess like I got a lot of attention from the press. So this is from a Canadian magazine actually. They said I electrified a global fashion scene. So I was like really happy about it. Like really, I was happy when, you know, like when they say all about, you know, all these things about, you know, what I do, etc. Obviously, that wasn't really the intention. The intention was to increase the value of the weave so that people will be willing to purchase it. And there's also an expression of identity, which is part of that. But I guess like the marketing part of it is essential for the sustainability of the entire enterprise. And then, yeah, so I guess one of the things that I wanted to mention is that when I got some traction overseas, it translated to greater traction here in the Philippines or in Manila. It's like before, people wouldn't really care much about like weaves and everything. It's only when you got like celebrities wearing them, you got, you know, like these clothes being worn elsewhere, when there's so much demand overseas, that locally it became a thing, at least in my experience. So that's what happened. And so this is from a fashion magazine in Spain. So I was like super happy, you know, to have my name with Kendall's name in it. I'm not sure like what your stand on her is, but yeah, I'm just really happy about that, because it was like gaining traction in some parts of the world. Okay, so we can have a pop quiz here. So I'm not sure if you guys know them. So Gelaine doesn't recognize the lady in red. So if you know who she is, like write it in chat. And if you know like the one in blue, write her name in chat as well.
You didn't have to tell everyone, Victor.
Yeah, like this is really funny. So the one on the left is from America's Next Top Model. So she was my first look for New York Fashion Week. And yeah, of course, like one of my clients who became like a great supporter for Kandama is Marian. And yeah, Marian Rivera, I'm not sure if you know her, but yeah, like she's on Instagram. She's quite popular here in the Philippines, actually. So around this time, it's when I guess was getting a lot of traction overseas, and you know, like getting media questions about my social impact. You know, I think there are a lot of designers in the world. There are a lot of amazing designers in the Philippines, but I guess like what sets us apart is the fact that there's a story, like there's a social impact behind it. And it's the time when I ask myself, do I really know how much impact I'm making? Am I really making an impact to begin with? How do I measure that kind of impact? So that's the time when I decided to go back to school. So I'm taking my master's on development management in Asian Institute of Management. The reason for which is because I wanted to really ensure that I have a social impact. I think this is what I was telling Gelaine about when I mentioned, you know, like the imposter syndrome, wherein you feel like you were getting so much attention, but you feel like you probably have to do something else. Like I wasn't sure if the impact was really there. So I had to measure it, like find ways to really ascertain that I get to scale that social impact as well. So so I went back to like studying the figures, making sure that everything is data driven, and research on the development agenda of the community and the province as well, and how it's linked with the development agenda of the Philippines in general and the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. And yeah, so we did a lot of studies like systems thinking and the theory of change. You know, for those people out there who are looking for funding, I'm sure Christine is there. I'm sure she's very familiar with how like this works. So building something like this makes sure that all of our activities are aligned with exactly what we wanted to do. So yeah, so that's the end point of the, like the presentation. So connect with us. That's my Instagram and the Facebook, Kandama Collective. When I wrote my the handle for my Instagram, Victorific Life, I completely forgot if it's like double R or triple R. So it's like, because I think I made this when I was still like very young. We'd come up with like really cool handles or what have you. Probably should change it.
Handle. Awesome. Thank you, Victor. Amazing. I think something that really stood out, just hearing your story a bit, and I think that many of us can relate to, is like hearing about your own journey, reconnecting with your Ifugao heritage and how you kind of grew up in proximity to it because you would go and travel back to Ifugao province and spend time, like meeting family members that are still there, but not necessarily like knowing like what Ifugao, culture is about or what it means to be Ifugao, like you said. And I think that's just something that many of us in the diaspora as Filipinos like can relate so much to that. It's like we grew up in proximity to, Filipino food and Filipino culture and like, Filipino family, but not necessarily being educated in the history or the culture or traditions. So I think that it's just like something that was really interesting, is just seeing that kind of parallel experience. And I guess something that I would really be interested to hear more about is like, when you were showing Kandama, and introducing like Ifugao weaves to like Paris Fashion Week or these really big shows, like what was that experience like to actually do those shows abroad? Like how was that? And what was the reception like?
I think one of the things that I love the most about like doing the shows is that there's always a Filipino community in these areas that are very supportive. So when I went to Paris, like, people from the government, from the diplomatic attaché of the Philippines were there, like the ABS-CBN correspondent was there. So they were really giving that kind of attention to me and to the kind of work that I'm actually doing overseas. So it was a really fun-filled experience because of the kind of warmth. And I guess like when you put like the indigenous like fashion in the mix, it's just something that's quite different like for a lot of people. So that's also great. But for the most part, what I also love about like doing these shows overseas is that it's also a collective effort from other indigenous communities that want to make sure that indigenous fashion will be in the mainstream fashion scene. So it's very collaborative. I mean, my background before was more of the competitive debating, but now I've moved on to a different space of being being co-creative, being collaborative, ensuring that we forward our different advocacies. It's a lovely space to be in, and it's a good thing to promote like Filipino culture overseas too.
Yeah. I think something, so I just would like to invite people, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. We might not be able to get to everything right now, but we will have an audience Q&A afterward. But drop in your questions and we will try to get to it if we can. But just relating to what you were saying, Victor, about, like being part of the global Indigenous community is how, I think something that was interesting that came up from our conversation before is how in many ways you kind of feel more closely connected to like the global Indigenous community. Yeah. Or the global Indigenous fashion community versus like the fashion community in Philippines. So can you like maybe just tell us a bit about that and why you think that is?
I guess for the most part, like fashion has in the Philippines, there's a particular pathway towards it, right? Like you go to a fashion school and then you're to become a fashion designer, or you become an apprentice, for example, of a fashion designer. So that's how it works. But I guess like in my case, my pathway is quite different. It was really more of like working with indigenous celebrities and designers and then like learning from them and learning things by doing things, because I have shows, for example, when the Global Indigenous Network featured me for Melbourne Fashion Festival, I'm forced to know how to sew. I remember like there'll be some times that I will go on YouTube and like figure out like how to sew, like hand stitch things and everything. So it was a baptism by fire, in all honesty. So that really forced me to really know things. That's the reason why I guess like I would like to pay a lot of homage to the Global Indigenous Network. It's only fairly recently that I'm connecting with different like local designers here in the Philippines, I think the reason why it's much easier for me to connect with a global Indigenous network is that we are more like-minded in terms of wanting to forward like Indigenous fashion. So it was more about the costs. It was more about like promoting the community as well as the heritage more than the glitzy side of it. I mean, of course, we love the glitz and stuff. We love, you know, like fabulous things and everything, but it's a question of like priorities. Like which one do you prioritize more? So in the mix of all of these things, I guess like the Indigenous network prioritizes like other things more than you know, like the fabulosity
Like
of the fashion world.
There's like a common goal that you're all working towards.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that all of the local designers are like that or that that's a bad thing. But I guess it's just like the mindset is very different. The mindset is about like it's more like celebrity focused.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. It's in many ways like, well, Kandama is a cultural enterprise. And I think that's something that with Cambio, we consider ourselves a cultural enterprise and a social enterprise, because you can both be focused on like environmental sustainability or ethical labor, for example, but also be focused on promoting and celebrating one's culture and like what that means through fashion. And I think that's what Kandama is doing.
I think that's also the reason why I decided to go back to school. Like, because my course is about like development management. Like in 2018, 2019, we're doing a lot of these fashion shows, and we're getting so much traction from celebrities, and which is a good thing. But I had to reassess and rethink. Like, why did I start this to begin with? It has something to do with the community. It has to ensure that I scale the impact. It's not just about the glamour and everything, which is really fun. And it adds to the sustainability of the community as well. But I guess I have to go back to what the core is, and it's all about, you know, the community. So
yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think we're getting some really good questions. One thing that I think, you know, just in terms of wearing weaves, or from a consumer perspective, it was Maria Christina who says, you know, a lot of people want to support Indigenous culture or Indigenous fashion designers, but they are worried about that appropriation aspect. So what, like, I guess this is a two-part question, but first part, for you as a designer, when it comes to using weaves, like you already kind of mentioned that there are certain design considerations you take, but can you talk a bit more about, as a designer, what are some of those things that you take into consideration when you do use these traditional textiles? What do you look out for? What are some lines you don't cross, for example?
Okay, sorry. Sorry if you're hearing like some construction work here. Okay, I guess like it's very important for you to know where you're getting the product as well, right? So if you're getting it from like Zara, obviously it might be like cultural appropriation, but if you're getting it from an Indigenous artist or an Indigenous like designer, most likely they know what they're doing, right? But of course, like you have to exercise due diligence still about that. But I guess like it's important for you to know like where you're getting that fabric, and the transparency is a very big thing now in you know, in sustainable fashion world. And I think like these brands are very keen on explaining and telling the story and saying where they sourced the garments and the process behind it. For me, for example, obviously I have to be familiar with what are the symbols that I can use and cannot use. There was an issue back then wherein like a funeral blanket was turned into a gown, and that became a good, you know, like such a travesty. And of course you don't want that to happen. So that's the reason why it's also quite difficult for me it's not that it's difficult, but I have reservations about like branching out to other Indigenous communities because I'm not very familiar with their culture, and I don't want to, you know, appropriate their culture. But it's something that I'm also looking into though, probably in terms of scaling the social impact, because there are other Indigenous communities which also need a lot of like support, and especially in terms of connecting them to the global marketplace. So yeah, so I guess like it's really a matter of like, as a designer, like really knowing and understanding the culture. And it starts with the intention. What is the intention anyway in entering a community and collaborating with the designers? How do you view the community to begin with? Do you view them as partners, or do you view them as employees, or do you view them simply as, I don't know, like a supplier? So it's a relationship that you have to build. And I guess like from there, you can tell if something is a cultural appropriation. So,
yeah, I think there's definitely so much to talk about with that on its own. And I think your question of like something that we ask ourselves often at Cambio is like, you know, who do you serve at the end of the day? Who, when you are putting something out there, who is this created for? Because there's obviously the end consumer, but at the same time, there are the people who are at the beginning of the supply chain, who are making the piece. So it's like, are you serving, like, how do you serve both of them in a way that is respectful? But I think at the end of the day, you know, when it comes to you as Kandama being a social enterprise that's really trying to create livelihood for weavers, you know, for the communities you work with, then I think that's where it has to begin, is like, how are we serving them? And like, of course, the end consumer, like people like us, we are obviously important in the factor, but we can't be at the beginning, because that's how exploitation can happen, right? And I think something that was interesting, I think just something that was a really interesting question that came up from Tin, you know, about this journey of finding permission from the Ifugao community, you know, and from yourself in terms of melding these different designs and symbols. Like how, I guess, what was that journey of like finding that permission to do that?
Well, for me, it wasn't really very difficult because for the most part, I consider myself as somebody who belongs to the community. Although there's always that like issue of, you know, like I did not grow up there, but it's more of like family is there, right? So they can easily talk to everybody from the community. And some of my relatives are actually from the community, you know, like some of them are really deeply involved in the weaving industry in Ifugao. So it wasn't really much of a struggle to enter. But I guess like during my social entrepreneurship training in Singapore, we were always informed, we were always like told to make sure that we wouldn't come in the community with that messianic complex, like, hey, we're gonna save you or something. So empowerment comes from within, and you can only facilitate it. You cannot really directly empower these communities. So I guess like that mindset is very important when you enter a community. I know it's also very difficult for some communities, but it's a lot of trust building, like confidence building measures that you have to exercise. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to engage all of the stakeholders if you want the program to be, or your initiative to be successful.
Yeah, I think it's something with Cambio actually, just in terms of communities, because I think it's a very important conversation to have, is like, how do you work with communities in a respectful way? And people ask us that all the time, is like, how do we find the artisan communities? And the reality is for Cambio, like, we actually purposely chose to partner with existing social enterprises, you know, and brands that are already doing the work, that have put in the years and the labor to be in these communities and to really understand the context. Because like, for me, even though I'm Filipino, I grew up like outside of Philippines, and I don't know the context of, you know, a community in Ifugao. Like, I would never understand that, even though I'm Filipino. And so for us, we purposely partner with people on the ground who are already doing that work, and who we can just kind of amplify their impact. So I think it's really related to kind of what you're saying, is like, it takes that time and like that respect of understanding, like, you can't just go in there expecting to just buy things and then that's it, and you solve people's problems, because that's not how it works. And so like, I think that's just, you know, I think when it comes to like some of the challenges, I guess, that Kandama has been having, you know, especially with COVID, like, that's definitely a big challenge. So can you talk a bit about like what have been some of the challenges for you in terms of like creating Kandama and working with Ifugao weavers, and basically reviving this craft that is really at risk of extinction? Like, what have been some of those challenges for you?
Okay, really quickly, I think Lynn has a very interesting question. The community is the Hulongan Weavers in Ifugao. So Hulongan is actually right beside, it's in Kiangan, Ifugao, right beside a UNESCO heritage site. So if you want to know more about this, I'll be more than happy to actually direct you to the website, or to, you know, have a conversation about these lovely people. When it comes to the challenges, I guess like, yeah, like engaging the community is also one thing. So what we do is that we donate looms, we donate threads, etc. But there's always this issue of like, oh, why did you donate to this person? Why not to me? Why did you donate to that community, not to this community, etc. So you have to justify a lot of things. So that's the reason why I realized that, okay, I have to take a step back, and then I have to step back a bit, and then like really try to measure things that can be measured, because if I cannot measure it, then I cannot manage things. And it's also harder to explain because it wouldn't seem very objective. And there's always like some hard feelings from certain people from the community because they did not receive the same amount of responsibility, the same amount of benefit or service from me. So that's, I guess, like the relationship is an ongoing thing. It will always be there. So it was quite easy for me to enter, but it's a question of how do you make sure that that relationship would really flourish and that you can really create the impact that you wanted to create in their lives and in the community as well as in my life. The other challenge that I had actually is to educate the buyers. I think like people who are working with artisans would know this, like Christine, who's probably out there, would also know this. Yeah, Christine from Amami. Like, she sent me a message earlier. Thank you so much. So a special shout out to you. And you know, like Cambio would also notice, because the artisanal products are not as cheap as the ones that you would actually see that are manufactured in a factory in China, for example. So you have to explain these things, like why sustainability is much more expensive. Sustainable products are much more expensive compared to other products, for example. What's the story behind this? That it's okay for you to wear something that's actually made by that community, and that there's no cultural appropriation that's actually being made. So that's another challenge. Being able to explain and communicate these things is. Last challenge that I can think of largely is being able to measure the things that are difficult to measure, like empowerment, for example. Like before, like, you know, it's difficult. If you are just starting with social entrepreneurship, you just don't know how to do these things. Like from law school, for example, I wasn't sure. Like I just memorize things, but I don't really, you know, like come up with programs and empowerment, for example. So these are the things that were my challenges, and I'm still working on a lot of them, actually. In the COVID situation, we are doing a lot of pivots. So one of which is, look at this. So yeah, so this is a face gear, like a face shield. And then we just like integrated like weaves here. So then we're also, you know, making masks is a big thing in the Philippines right now, and like other parts of the world. In some parts of the world, apparently they aren't, but they should. So that's what a lot of like artisans are actually doing right now, and a lot of fashion houses doing like the gear so that people can protect themselves from the COVID virus. But like now we're also coming up with another pivot that we're making is to collaborate with celebrities. Like, we have like celebrity clients, but we don't really like make products with them. So now it's we're doing like it's a co-creation of products. So we have this very interesting work with, I'm not gonna name the celebrity yet, but like they ask us to submit a proposal, or her lawyer asked us to submit a proposal to them, but we're making a loungewear line with the celebrity, and she's quite popular in the Philippines and in the universe. So I'm not gonna name who yet.
In the universe. I think that's a pretty big hint.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really, really good questions in the chat right now about cultural appropriation. So I think, and I actually have a bunch of my own questions as well, but I think because so many of the audience questions are focused on the appropriation side, I think we'll save that for the audience Q&A. And then right now, I actually would just like to ask you to just tell us a bit more of the pieces that you have, because you're wearing some Kandama pieces and you've got some weaves behind you. So maybe you can just like tell us a little bit, like, you know, briefly about some of the symbols or like some of the designs that you have.
Okay, so well, I have this, like, there are two types of weaving actually, to bring out the symbols. One is through ikat or tie-dye. So you bring out the symbols by tying the parts that you like, so that when you dye it, like the parts which are tied wouldn't get dyed. So then when you untie things, that's when you can see the symbols. So this is one of them. And So I guess like a celebrity, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Christian Bautista. He's a singer. So this is something that he wore. Then there's like some fabrics. It's a combination of like diamond. Diamond is actually a star, and then the pestle. So the symbols that you see in the weaves are actually things that our ancestors see in their immediate physical environment. So the question now is, if the younger generation would continue weaving, then most likely you'd be able to see things like an iPhone, for example, in the weaves, like, like modern houses or what have you, because these are things that you can see in their immediate surroundings. And we want that. We want the new generation to reflect their existing reality, so that the culture would also evolve. I mean, like, it's a part of the culture which we preserve, but at the same time, in order for it to survive, it has to adapt. It has to, reflect current realities, their lived realities, and not the realities simply of the generation before them. So I guess like that's one of the things that I forgot to point out. It's making these, or enticing the young generation, the current generation, to get into the craft of hand weaving.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point you bring up, because a lot of people have the idea or the impression that if it's, indigenous culture always stays the same. I think that's kind of like a misconception a lot of people have. Like, we kind of romanticize what it means to be part of an indigenous community, but really, like, indigenous culture, like any culture, evolves and changes. Like you said, like the symbols could change based on what people are seeing around them. And I think that's something that has been really interesting, and that's important for people to learn about, because that's something that I've only learned about recently. And that actually brings us perfectly to our next part, which is just our audience kind of interactive component. So for those of you who registered over the weekend, there's a question that some of you answered, which is, in what direction would you like Filipino fashion to go? What's the future of Filipino fashion? And if you didn't get a chance to answer this question, then please drop your response in the chat. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. But we did get some very cool responses that I'll share with you. So in what direction would you like Filipino fashion to go? Some people shared, they would like to see it become more modern. Some people would like to see it become indigenized. Someone share that they'd like to go forward while calling back our roots of sustainability, because there are so many things in our pre-colonial traditions that are actually rooted in sustainability and natural materials. Other things that people shared too, which I love this, I'd love for Filipino fashion to continue its global rise and be more present and accessible internationally. I'd also love to see Filipino fashion as a way for us to stay connected to our indigenous roots. And then someone said, I'd love to see Filipino fashion integrated with street fashion, which is really very cool. And there's actually some very cool articles that are coming out right now about street fashion in Manila, which is very, very interesting. So I'd love to hear kind of what some of your thoughts are. Let me see if there are some responses in the chat. Ashley would love to see Filipino fashion be led by and for the communities, which is so, so good. Chino, I hope that the lumban embroidery doesn't die, and I hope for the future generations to continue appreciating their own art. Nikki would love for sustainable fashion to be the norm. Yes, these are all super good. Maria Christina, fashion from different areas. We only really get to see well-known pieces. That is so, so true. Like Cebu, there's actually some amazing Filipino fashion designers in Cebu, and we don't really get to see or hear about them as much either. So very cool. So continue adding your responses in the chat. We would love to hear them. And Victor, I guess my question for you, or our question for you, is in what direction would you like to see Filipino fashion to go in? What do you kind of envision for the direction of Filipino fashion?
I guess it's something that's sorry, my ideal fashion designer is Gu Pei. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with her, but she's this couture designer. There's only few invited designers outside of Western Europe or Asia actually, who were invited to be part of the chamber of fashion designers in Paris, and she's one of those. So she's so good at really trying to show their heritage and show how amazing the work, the craftsmanship of of Chinese are. So I want to do the same thing for the Filipinos and show like how intricate our like the details are of our work. So I guess like the direction that I would like to think as like a Filipino fashion to go is a bit like more high fashion. I love the entire like streetwear concept as well. So maybe like in those directions, I wanted to go in all directions generally, but like for me, I guess like that dominant direction would be a bit more like high fashion, just to elevate the entire culture and heritage, because that's how you try to activate, like energy here in the Philippines. When people see and look up to it, that's when these other, I guess, like movements in the fashion industry would actually like start doing a lot of other things. But I think that's the first thing though.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, there's so many like you said, there's so many different directions, and I think that's something for me personally. Like I would love to see Filipino fashion go in all sorts of directions. Like I think a lot of us we have this idea in our head that Filipino fashion is like the Ternos or the Maria Claras, but there's like so much more to our Filipino history and to our like culture of fashion that's like that we don't even know about, right? And so I'd like to, before we go into the audience Q&A and like a brief pause, I just want to kind of like bring it back to, again, our rallying cry of like, wear your heritage and why it's important, because there is so much pride in wearing things that are made from our culture that really not are just made by Filipinos, but are actually made for Filipinos as well. And this is kind of like one of the most tangible ways that we can really express ourselves and really celebrate who we are and where we come from. Like there's just so much craftsmanship and culture and history. And so there's a reason why this is one of our main advocacies. And these are some of the stories that we've gotten from some of our community members. And so if you have a story of where your heritage and why you wear your heritage, we would also love to hear from you. And so we're gonna take a really brief pause to just like allow us to refill our drinks and like go to the bathroom or whatever you need. But just before we do that, I would like to just do a special thank you to our friends at Kape. So Iona is actually here in the chat. She is one of the founders of Kape along with her partner Paolo. And so Kape is a Canadian social enterprise promoting direct-to-farmer coffee from Philippine Indigenous women growers, all roasted in small batches. They work closely with a community of native coffee growers in Benguet, Cordilleras, and Davao del Sur. And Kape brings some of the most unique and flavorful coffees from the Philippine Highlands to Canada and beyond. And they've even invited us to visit them, the coffee plantation, next time we are in Philippines and allowed to go to Philippines. So really excited for that. And you can check them out. Nikki has dropped the links. And because Kwentuhan is best over drinks, Kape has very generously offered to do a little giveaway for one of our attendees here today. So one of our attendees gets a free package of Auntie Florencia and Uncle Florencio's coffee. And so the lucky winner who we just randomly chose from our list of guests today is, I wrote it down, Richie from Winnipeg. So congratulations, Richie. We will reach out to you after today's session to coordinate your Kape prize. And thank you very much to Kape for partnering with us. And so with that said, congratulations, yay. With that said, we're gonna take a quick 2-minute break. So we will reconvene at 9:05. So just, if you haven't yet, please drop some questions into the chat box and we will get back in about 9:05. Hi everyone, we're gonna get started. I know it was a quick break. Hopefully you're able to refill your drinks, get some beer, maybe some San Miguel, some Tanduay, whatever, keeping you hydrated right now. Victor, when you are ready, we can start.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so Q&A time. We got a lot of questions. Thank you all for sending them. Like we said, a lot of the questions did focus on the appropriation, on the cultural appropriation side. For those of you just wondering in terms of timing right now, we're gonna go for maybe the next like 20 minutes or so, see how many questions we can get through, and then close off from there and aim to be done before 9:30. So just to start then, one of the questions that we got from Justine are, what are your thoughts on the representation of Ifugao people in your marketing and also the people who model your clothes?
My thoughts in the representation.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so appropriation is done if you don't give credit to the community. So that's the reason why we always give credit to, we always tell our consumers like where the clothes actually do come from. And for all of our consumers, that's actually what you're paying for. It's a story. So just make sure that you are very familiar with the story behind the pieces. Like what do the symbols mean? These are like conversation starters. So yeah, like make sure that you're also familiar with who is the weaver behind it. Like they have stories too, they have names, and you can possibly ask the brands about these things. Considerations in terms of the models that we get, for the most part, with some of the organizers that we made, sometimes they just give us like the models. Sometimes we get to pick like who we want. Of course, as much as possible, I want to get like Filipinos or somebody with Filipino heritage modeling it, largely because of the heritage or cultural value of the garments. In instances where we cannot have that, then I'm completely fine with it. I guess like for me in my head, it's more like it's co-creative, it's collaborative. It's also quite important for us to be able to work with people who are in the mainstream fashion industry in order for the indigenous fashion industry to thrive, and to work with people in the mainstream, I guess like mainstream scene, like celebrities, for example, because they definitely create this exponential effect in terms of making sure that the social enterprise becomes sustainable. So yeah, like we also have a lot of like people who are marginalized who model, or I mean like marginalized in the sense that they have minority status in some parts of the world. Like we obviously have African Americans, the entire Black Lives Matter thing that's going on right now. So they're also, because we also want to showcase inclusivity. I mean, it's a bit ironic. Sorry. It's how do you put it? But the thing is that like we're all about indigenous inclusivity. So it's about a certain minority. So for you not to care about like Black lives as well, it's like a double standard. So
sorry. Just like to, I guess for my own reference, like when you do the global fashion shows, you don't bring those models with you. They're just people who are already part of the show that are then you can choose from the models that are hired from the show, but you don't actually have any say in the fashion shows themselves.
Some of them we actually do. Like for example, the guy whom you see on the screen, he is a Filipino American who is based in New York, and then he's a friend of a friend, and then like he said, oh, I wanted the model and everything because he modeled in the Philippines back then, and okay, so I got him to model for me for New York Fashion Week. So there, like in New York, it's quite easy to get a lot of like Filipino Americans to actually like model for me, but in Paris, it's a different story because there's not a lot of, apparently, relatively, there's not a lot of like Filipinos there. Who are working in the fashion industry, so it's much harder. So in those cases, I would rather I go for like indigenous models because we are, like in a global indigenous network, so it's quite easy to get like the indigenous models. For me, there are instances wherein the organizers just provide the models. I think the one that I'm supposed to do in Toronto, last May, that one, like, they're going to provide all of the models. So you cannot bring your own model. So there are some shows like that are like that.
Yeah.
But because they have a cost though, because they wanted Indigenous models to be the one to walk, Indigenous models from Canada to be the one to walk. That's the reason why there's an exclusivity.
Because it was for Indigenous Fashion Week. That's the show.
Yeah, that's for Indigenous Fashion Week. Oh, by the way, like, just want to plug this. So we're gonna, instead of that show, we're gonna have that we're gonna have a fashion film this November. So featuring like our collection and other Indigenous communities as well.
Okay. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, so we'll make sure to keep an eye out for that, and you should follow us all on socials to get updates on when that film is. Just to switch up, in terms of, there's a question from Steph who wants to know your thoughts on Filipino businesses or social enterprises in the diaspora, so outside of Philippines, who are selling Ifugao clothing, or maybe just selling any like inspired by, Indigenous designs, but that are not necessarily being made from those communities, like, but they're still paying Filipino communities, for example. So what are your thoughts on like those kind of inspired by kind of Ifugao or Indigenous designs or brands that are not working with the Indigenous communities, but they are working with Filipino communities?
I think it's really hard to judge, largely because I don't know their own journey. It could be that they have the intention of working with Indigenous communities. It's just that they don't know how to. So hopefully they are reaching out to these people. I guess like if there's a redounding effect to the community, to the Indigenous communities, then why not? I guess like that's gonna be a good thing. I guess like, the amazing thing about all of these other brands doing it outside of the Philippines is that it's also creating that ripple effect here, wherein it's making it seem like it's a good thing to wear Indigenous fabrics, right? So even if, for example, like there's no direct effect to the community, Indigenous community, if somebody from Canada, for example, would see that it's a cool thing to wear, Indigenous fabrics, then that person like reaches out to an Indigenous community, then that is the impact. There are unintended consequences to this though. I mean, so we also have to be mindful of that. Things like that it's okay for you to shortchange things and not really pay respect to the community anymore. So as much as possible. So I guess like this is where the entire sustainability would come in. And part of that is knowing transparency in terms of production. Where did they get the weaves? How was it produced, etc. So I guess like it's more of the consumers who should be vigilant about these things and should be mindful of like green, like washing, or I don't know, like what's the term for, like cultural washing or something, like pretending as if it came from a community.
I guess.
Like appropriation.
Yeah. I can add in.
That's a form of appropriation.
Yeah, I can add in.
If you don't give credit, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Like in terms of, I guess, just in terms of like some of the red flags, I guess, is like some things that I've seen is like, if it's inspired by Ifugao culture, then it's kind of like, I think when you are using, Indigenous culture as a way to profit and to like market your brand, then that's very damaging, because like that takes away opportunities from those communities themselves. And it is harder, like you were saying, Victor, I think I think everyone starts somewhere. And I think that's kind of where we need to call in brands and call in people, because I think at the end of the day, like you said, I think most of us are working towards trying to promote Filipino heritage and Filipino craftsmanship and celebrate like who we are. But at the same time, like there's a lot of negative impacts when we do it carelessly or thoughtlessly in a way. And even though it is hard to necessarily source Ifugao weaves, for example, it's not impossible. And I think that's part of, I think that's part of the journey of if you want to use those weaves, I think that's part of the work that you have to put in. But I think also, Oh, sorry. One thing.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Well, one thing I think that you're saying too is like the importance of also amplifying, the fact that there are these like higher profile designers that are using Ifugao textiles or Indigenous textiles, like that does bring a lot of visibility, which is, which is really important, and we do need that. And so I think that's where, I guess that's where we just need to be like vigilant about making sure that we are, as consumers, we're holding people accountable, and that we are, we are calling people in rather than calling out, which is like, I don't think it necessarily does anything very effective when we just try to like call out designers or call out brands. So anyway, that's my perspective. Sorry.
I guess we just have to be very mindful of the unintended consequences. Like, for example, one time Jerome and I went to Manila Fame, and we saw like some Indigenous designs actually printed in fabric. Yes. So that's much easier to do. It's much cheaper, and it becomes an alternative to like hand-woven textile. And you're stealing, I guess like that is problematic because you're stealing the idea from like an ancient symbol. You're killing the story, but at the same time, you're killing the industry because it's now becoming unsustainable for you to weave, for the weavers to weave, because people can just like opt for like a very cheap like printed textile. Like it kills the entire purpose of like promoting hand-woven product, which is already being killed by the influx of like Chinese manufactured like textiles. So we just have to be mindful about those things.
It's pretty problematic. Like I think what people are asking today is, as a consumer, what are the things that we can kind of look out for? And I think part of it, like you said, it starts with asking those questions of like, who made these weaves? Like, who made this fabric? Was it made in partnership with the communities? Because if not, then why was it not? And like, how do we then hold that accountable and get those brands to start doing it? And I guess like one other question that someone had is, so Tin would like to know about the distinction between, I guess, authentically traditional versus artistic expressions of tradition. So I guess like, what are the lines that you draw when it comes to using like traditional textiles, but still allowing room for, for like those different forms, I guess. I hope I phrased this question properly.
I think for me, like, it's really about the intention, and the intention is very difficult to assess because we really don't know. I mean, you can only see it through other manifestations, for example, like other physical manifestations of the person's behavior, or like what the person says about it. Like why does she want to do something to begin with? So if it's simply something to profit at scale, for example, like what other fast fashion brands are actually doing, then obviously we have like deep reservations about it. So I guess like at the end of the day, it's also about the impact. Like what is the consequence of doing something? Then in that instance, I think that you are probably crossing the line. When if it's simply like artistic expression for the sake of artistic expression and not necessarily to malign anyone, then like I guess like that's completely fine. But I guess like the best scenario is for the artist to co-create with the community to which like he's drawing he or she's drawing the inspiration from, right? Like what is the deeper story behind it? So I guess it's a matter of depth as well, more than like, oh, I feel like drawing this like Ifugao symbol or what have you. Like I guess like that's completely fine. But it's better if you know the story behind it. It's better if you can tell, oh, I met this weaver, etc., and she told me that this is the story behind it, so I'm inspired by that.
So Chino would like to know, where, for someone who wants to work and learn from Filipino designers, but they don't know where to start, like what advice do you have for someone like that?
I guess the first, the starting point would be like to reach out. I mean, you wouldn't know like who will reply. Maybe the more established ones wouldn't, maybe they will. So like probably like try to just try to reach out. Like, I mean, you wouldn't know, in all honesty. So when I started this enterprise, I reached out to 7 different designers across like different disciplines, from like, like footwear designer, furniture designer, et cetera. And I wasn't sure like if they're gonna respond to me, but like thankfully like 7 of them responded. You just have to start somewhere. You just have to, well, this is the good start, right? Like, we're having a conversation right now. So maybe I can link you to somebody, if I cannot provide the assistance that you wanted. I think like there was also somebody from New York. She's probably there in the audience right now. Like, she sent me a message on Instagram, and she also wanted to learn fashion designing. So by some chance, like she got stuck here in Manila because of the lockdown. So I'm not sure when she's gonna fly back to New York, but she wanted to visit as an intern or something. So you can start from that. You can start with a project probably, or what have you. So it's, again, another thing that we have to understand is that there has to be a fair exchange of energy as well. Like, if the designer will be, like sharing his or her expertise, then I guess, it depends how you're gonna negotiate what a fair exchange is, but probably like sharing whatever expertise that you also have can also work. Like an X deal, for example. I have like an X deal with my accountant. I'm like, okay, do my accounting. I'm gonna make dresses for your wife. So those kinds of things. So I guess like there are a lot of creative ways, and just expect that the universe or God or whatever you call the higher being will always be there to lead you to the right person and to the right direction.
Yeah, awesome. Isabella has a really excellent question, which is very timely and relevant. So, given the social unrest of the Philippines, how would you say Kandama Collective itself, and I guess fashion on a bigger picture, how would you say that Kandama is a site of activism and a form of, how would you say that Kandama is a site of activism and uses fashion in a political way?
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting question, because we are really living in trying times right now. As much as possible, I would want to, although it's very difficult, but I would want to create a distinction between my politics as well as Kandama's politics. Because Kandama is largely about women empowerment, about like cultural preservation, etc. Not necessarily in terms of like civil liberties or what have you, right? Like or like creating like spaces of freedom within the society. But I'm that person. I'm a progressive. I would love to think I'm progressive, libertarian kind of person. So that's my ideological underpinning. So it's so difficult, largely given the kind of context that we're in, because you have a lot of trolls, for example, who can just like barrage you with things on your like social media accounts, right? Like, so it's very difficult to be quite outspoken, especially if you are a small brand in the country. But to have like, we're making like subtle ways of showcasing our activism. It's very difficult to be all out about it. But if you're gonna look at our Instagram account, you're gonna see something there about like one of my journalist friends wearing a kandama, and the hashtag is like freedom of the press, right? I was like thinking of posting Lea Salonga's photo wearing kandama, largely because she's getting flack right now from a lot of people for, I think, criticizing like the government shutdown of ABS-CBN. So I wanted to post like, like love you through and through, Lea Salonga, etc. Just to give her some support. But again, you as a business owner, you also have to think twice about these things, like, right? Like, because we might have some consumers out there who are, like pro-government, and it's going to be it's a very, very difficult thing, in all honesty.
I think also the context in Philippines, to be honest, is very different than the context around in terms of free speech, especially right now. And I think we will just leave it at that. But I think it's a very
sorry. I thought that was the direction that you wanted to take. Yeah.
You know, I think the context is also different, and I think just something linked to around fashion and as activism, like something that came up at our past Kwentuhan with Christine of Amami that she said, which really stuck, is like when we preserve craftsmanship and we find ways to use it and we make it relevant and something that people, you know, that people really want and will pay for, like that on its own is a form of resistance. Especially when you talk about Indigenous culture and Indigenous craftsmanship, like Indigenous communities have gone through so much violence and so much oppression that continues to this day. So when we actually continue to support Ifugao weavers to do work to preserve, you know, Ifugao craftsmanship and these forms of Indigenous craftsmanship and provide livelihood for those communities, like in using fashion as a medium to do that, like that on its own is a form of resistance and activism. So I think that's, you know, on its own, what Kandama is doing, I think, in my opinion, I think it is political, even if it's not necessarily like political in the sense that we might think. And with that, like, I know there's so many questions and like so many really great things and we barely scratched the surface, but I guess since we are nearing the end, I guess would like a question to the audience itself. If Kandama, because they're, you know, Kandama, we don't currently work with Kandama on Cambio or carry Kandama's collections, but if there was a chance for Kandama to be on Cambio, what would you all like to see? What kind of articles of clothing or items would you like to see? We would love to hear your thoughts. Kala says everything. That's helpful. That's helpful, Kella. Loungewear, says Jerome, which I had to second. I had to second the loungewear part. Dresses, robes, yes. So people, please continue dropping things in the chat because this is super helpful for us. I won't say why, but this is helpful information because there are some cool things. I guess Kandama has some cool things in the pipeline, always has a lot going on in Victor's life. And so while people are dropping those things in the chat, I would like to just take this time to say thank you, maraming salamat to all of you for being here and sharing space, especially during these very difficult times. And so we really appreciate you being here and wanting to support not just the Cambio community, but the whole Filipino community itself. The fact that we're all here coming together, you know, in these circumstances and trying to find ways to support our indigenous communities in Philippines and supporting one another, I think is a testament to how powerful our community truly is. So please stay connected with us. Our Instagram is cambio_co. For anyone planning Filipino weddings or Filipino festivities, you can find wedding accessories all designed and handcrafted in the Philippines at our sister company, Cinta_co. And of course, follow Victor and Kandama at Kandama Collective on Instagram. And as well, once you get the recording for this session, which we will release tomorrow, then please do share it with your friends, your family, and help us to spread the word and also to support the important work that Kandama is doing. Thank you all for being here. If I'll keep I think people are still putting things in the chat, so I'll keep things going a little bit, but yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Also, just send me a message if you guys want to like continue the conversation.
Yes, Victor
I'll be more than happy to.
Yeah, Victor's like a well of knowledge, and he's also doing his schooling right now, learning so much. Yeah, so lots of knowledge going on, and we'll also likely do a blog post as well for our community to talk a little bit about some of the questions that came up today, because I think there's just so much to unpack. But yeah, I think with that, looks like the chat has kind of quieted down, so I think I'll end things there. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day/evening wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.